yard work going on in my neighbor's yard. So that's
You're fine. You're fine. Anything that's super abrasive, I can edit out. Not a big deal.
Okay, cool.
Thanks for agreeing to do this. I know.
Oh yeah, no, thank you. Thank you for dealing with me forgetting that last time. I'm so sorry again.
It happens. If that's the worst thing that happens to me while I'm doing my podcast, we're great.
Okay. It's unlike me, so I was like, that's when you gotta start you need less work if you're forgetting stuff, It's like,
Hey, I can sympathize with all that.
Okay.
So let's go ahead and begin with maybe an introduction. Who you are, what your title is, where you work, all that good stuff.
Okay. And just one other question I have for you. So I'm assuming you're recording right now, but you're going to edit everything. So if I make mistakes, we can just restart and it's fine.
If you make mistakes, I can edit them and make them nice and loud so that everybody can hear them.
Yeah.
Yes. I'll make sure that it sounds good.
Okay, cool. Okay, so my name is Antonia Florio. I'm a science communications liaison at Everglades National Park. What that means is I try to take the work that's happening in the park, specifically the research and monitoring, and translate it for different audiences. It includes the public, the scientific community, students, many different audiences.
Is that something that you knew you wanted to do at a young age?
No, not at all. This might be something you had. I've always joked that I don't like people, but it seems like I do. And I wind up in jobs where I interact with people. And I think it's really ironic. I was one of those kids that grew up, just loving animals and thinking the only thing that you can do if you love animals is be a veterinarian. But then after that, I don't know if you want the whole spiel, but
sure.
No. Okay. So then I went to undergrad to become a veterinarian, and then I worked at a vet's office, which is what everyone should do, is learn, do what you think you want to do. And it turned out I didn't want to do that, and it was pretty traumatic to find that out, to say the least. I was like, no, I thought that's what I wanted. I didn't. But then it turned out it was great because it opened up this avenue where I started really pursuing research. Mm-hmm. So I did my undergrad in biology, and then wound up going to grad school, getting a PhD in comparative biology, studying chameleons and evolution, and loved it. But always been drawn to doing outreach and education. So immediately after grad school, I started pursuing jobs that were more education and outreach. And I've worked at nonprofits, and I've worked for the Park Service, so government work, for about 3.5 years now. But never thought I would in the beginning. Now it makes sense. It's logical. I love doing this, but I never thought.
It's interesting that you started off with such a niche like chameleons. It seems like a lot of people find a very specific animal. Is that common amongst the biology trade?
I don't know. I think it depends. It definitely was. So I went to grad school at the Museum of Natural History, and it was definitely common there. My friends that I grew up with would sometimes make fun of us at parties because everyone would be like, oh, this is my special organism, it's fish, and this is my special organism. And so we all definitely came from a position of passion. For me, it might be the nature of the programs themselves, because when you do a PhD, you're so specific, like you're doing, this really, you can't, most people, sometimes you're doing multi-scale species studies and large-scale ecological studies, but a lot of times you're pinpointing a specific issue. And so for me, I also always joke that chameleons are a gateway herp. My undergraduate advisor came and gave a talk in our undergraduate class, and I was just captivated by his work in Madagascar, the idea of Madagascar, how much biodiversity was there, and how good chameleons were at answering questions about speciation and just how cool they were in general. So that's how it happened to me, but it does seem like a pattern, right? You find one thing that you love. Ironically, that's kind of what happened, though. I became so knowledgeable about these 4 species of chameleons that I started missing the broader picture. And that's not true for research in general. Like, I don't want to, a lot of researchers have a general broad perspective, and especially after grad school, you gain that. But I really wanted it right then and there. And so that, I think, was drawing me towards jobs also that were more broad in scale. And my job at the Park Service right now is super, I feel like I have I feel like I'm in a position where I can really understand what is happening generally in the park. And that's really cool. So like I get a little bit of, on one day I might learn like, oh, we had to close this area of the park because wading birds just started nesting. So we need to get that on the website and we need to get that out to the public. Or there's a fire in the park and we need to let people know. So I kind of hear about everything that's happening in the park, and it's pretty cool.
I want to talk more about the park, but I've got to know just a little bit more about chameleons first.
Okay.
Give me an example of one of the things that you studied specifically about a chameleon. I know you mentioned Madagascar and how well they were able to adapt and stuff. Just give me like a little brief snippet of something that you looked at.
So I studied this one. I studied 4 broadly distributed species of chameleons across Madagascar. One of them I studied was Furcifer lateralis. It's called the carpet chameleon, super pretty little guy, but found throughout Madagascar, almost every habitat there. So sometimes the chameleons are a little like very specific to a region and they're unique in that way. But this chameleon was found across the entire continent, island continent. Mm-hmm. And to me, that was great from my perspective because I got to go to every place in Madagascar to sample it and find it. But something that's cool about that one is it's in Madagascar. It's like kind of a trash chameleon, which is weird. So it's like, everyone sees it. It's like here in Florida, we have a knoll species, like the invasive brown anoles and like the green anoles that are native. And you just see them everywhere. You grew up with them, and that's kind of what Furcifer lateralis was. So it was funny to talk to people. They're just like, "That's the one you're looking for."
It's everywhere.
It's everywhere, and it's like literally in like you would find it like in rice fields or in villages was the best place to find it. It was just prevalent. So what I was looking at was whether or not it was actually a complex of different species, and what I wound up doing was taking samples from throughout the island continent and some morphological vouchers, but also genetics. And I was looking at, are these previously described subspecies, are they actually their own species? Where are the boundaries between different species or subspecies? And I was able to find that there were actually 3 different species nested within the group using that method. And it was really cool to do that. It's been a while since I thought about it. It's been a long time. Yeah, it was really fun. And it was also, I guess, kind of like this whole interdisciplinary idea of me. It was really fun to use different methods. So it was like, you can't just use genetics alone. You can't just look morphology or how they look alone. You can't just use ecological niche models or what kind of environments you're likely to find them in alone. It was really using all these different methods together to get a holistic view on the chameleon across Madagascar and using that to inform your decisions. So,
was it a big change going from looking at this little microcosm of a niche to somewhere like the Everglades, where I've never been there, but my vision of the Everglades is that there are so many different species of animals there that it would be hard to keep track of?
Well, we'll go back to, for myself, I always find that I'm trying to be a better naturalist. I'm from New York City. I did not grow up doing this stuff. And so it's all been kind of this whirlwind of learning for me from the time I was an adult. I didn't grow up doing any of this. I actually sent up my first tent when I was in Madagascar. I had never even really camped. I mean, my friend had helped me once, but not really. So it was quite the learning curve. So go ahead.
I didn't learn how to ride a bike until I was in my mid-20s, so you're fine.
Yeah. And it's like, it shows you can do it whenever. If the interest is there, you'll find it. So going back to that, I'm always trying to be a better naturalist. And I actually think with the Everglades, we have like the big animals that everyone thinks about that you should, because they're so cool, like alligators and crocodiles. And, it can actually be pretty difficult to tell apart an alligator and a crocodile if you're not super trained. Sometimes people confuse them. But in general, like you'll say, oh, that's an alligator, that's a crocodile. But something that is cool about the Everglades is it's a little bit like there's so many plants here, for example, and you really learn to kind of take a moment and take a step back and when you get on a trail, and it could just be that you're just looking at green shrubs and green vegetation. But a lot of what we talk about here in the Everglades is that you kind of need to take someone along and stop them and slow down and look at everything around you. And then you really start seeing the biodiversity that this place has. So many places. So I don't know if that answered your question, but I like that about the Everglades, is that it kind of makes you take a moment and stop what you're doing and just really take a close look at everything around you, and you find out how cool things are if you take that moment.
The Everglades is kind of odd to me because whenever I think of a national park, I think about our western parks. So
Mhm.
Rocky Mountain, Yosemite, these mountainous terrains, and you go to the other side of the country, down there in Florida, and there's no hills, right? It's all flat.
Mm.
It's basically just wetland.
Yeah.
And you said there's trails. How do you have trails through a wetland? I don't.
Yeah.
It's hard for me to wrap my head around that.
Yeah, no, I totally understand. And it's what we often get visitors who are like, where are the mountains? Or, or well, it's just, I've been to national parks in the West, and it's all about the awe. Like you just like climb atop a mountain and you look around, you're just like, oh my God, and it's like these breathtaking views. And then the Everglades, it's different, we have hills, they'll be like a couple feet high, and it's really exciting. So there is slight elevation changes.
Uh-huh.
And so something that I think is important to know about the Everglades, and something we always take a look at, is water is always flowing. So it's a river of grass, right? It's not like like a swamp or something where water's stagnant. There's always water flowing. And it's because of these slight elevation changes. And that water flow is crucial for all of life in Florida. So it's very, very slow water flowing. So we do have elevation changes. It's just very small. And you don't get on top of a mountain and look across, right? But we do have, so going back to the idea of like what I think you're asking, like, what do you do here? How do you experience the park?
Kind of like a broad brushstroke of the park. I've never
Yeah.
been there. I've never really even looked at it a whole lot. So I don't even know where it's located. Any of that stuff. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I can help you with that a little bit. So the park is located in southern Florida. So how to best describe that? Hold on, I lost my.
Is it East Coast or West Coast?
Oh, okay, hold on. I lost you for a second. Oh, here you are. Okay. Am I always there even when I change?
You're good.
Yeah. Okay. So eastern side of the United States, you drive all the way down the eastern coast, almost to the very, very tip of Florida, that very bottom, and that's where you'll find Everglades National Park.
So close to the Keys?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, you can actually, part of the park includes Florida Bay. Actually, Florida Bay makes up like 1/3 of the park.
Okay.
And Florida Bay, part of it is Everglades National Park, actually. So it includes Florida Bay, which you could get to from the Keys.
All right, that helps me a lot. Now I know where we're at.
Okay. So that's where you're at when you're in the park. And then Everglades National Park itself is very large. And there's 4 visitor centers scattered across the park. Mm-hmm. So on the east side of the park, you're kind of close to Miami when you're by the park. And so if you want to go to the visitor center that's closest to Miami, you go to a visitor center called Shark Valley. And that's kind of a Miami person's backyard. A little bit of a tourist backyard. Well, just in the fact that it's close to Miami. So if you come down, you could easily go from the airport to Shark Valley pretty quickly. I think it would be like an hour, maybe a little longer. But anyway, not far.
Okay.
And then there's another entrance if you drive south, even further south of Miami, to an area called Homestead. That's kind of like the last stop before you get to the Keys. And that entrance is called the Homestead entrance. It's where another visitor center is. So that's another place you could visit. And then you also could go to I know I said we were on the east side of Florida, so now I'm confusing you. I need a map.
No, you're good. I'm perfectly fine.
You're fine. Okay, so then you could go a little bit west, and you get close to this area called Everglades City.
Yep.
And that's on the Gulf Coast side. And that is where you would have the Gulf Coast Visitor Center. And the thing I guess I'll emphasize, and then last, when you want to drive all the way down almost to Florida Bay, there's a visitor center called Flamingo. And that's where you're basically on Florida Bay.
Okay.
And the thing that's cool, like if you go to Shark Valley, or if you go to that homestead entrance where there's the Ernest Cove Visitor Center, you have land options. So you can go on some land trails. They're really cool. You can
Okay.
even do a bicycle ride on Shark Valley, which is really fun for families. And you could take a loop. You're always in Shark Valley, almost always going to see an alligator. It's very
Nice.
exciting. But the Gulf Coast visitor centers and the Flamingo visitor centers, there are some trails, but those are areas where you really get out by going on the water.
Okay, I was going to say, you said land trails, so that leads me to the assumption that there are water trails.
Yeah, yeah. And yes. So when you go to Gulf Coast, it's almost entirely water. The National Park Service part of it. And so the best thing to do when you get there is to get in a canoe or a kayak, and you can even just, go in that little area and see things. Some people take longer trips out, and you can even go with a concessions tour. And when you go out there, then you can spend even like overnight in the water. So let me take a moment and explain that a little bit. So at Gulf Coast and Flamingo, there's this cool way where you can get out and you could paddle to specified areas that are known as chickies. You ever heard of that?
No, chickies.
Yeah,
Okay.
there's a lot of fun words down here. And I forget, I should know this, but I always forget what it means in terms of, I think it was from either one of the native tribes that lived down that were here where we came. I think it was one of their words. And what it is it's essentially an elevated platform, wooden platform where you can just pitch a tent for a night. So you can actually camp on the water.
Really?
Yeah, it's pretty magical. Although I haven't done it, so I shouldn't say that, but it's something I really want to do. And I say it's magical because I see the photos and I've seen some videos, and I think, I think that's something that I've done a lot of hiking. I love hiking, learning the water world myself. But that just seems like a completely unique experience, where you could just pack up your canoe, take what water you need for a week or longer, and just go from chickie to chickie.
Chickie hopping.
Yeah.
I assume that there is a large diversity of aquatic animals there. You've mentioned Shark Bay?
Oh, Shark River Valley.
Shark River Valley.
Oh, Shark
Are there
River,
actually sharks there?
So not at Shark Valley. There are areas in the Everglades that are low lying, where water tends to flow fast, or tends to flow more, and those are called sloughs. So Shark Valley, now I'm getting myself all confused. Shark Valley is an area where people go in Miami, and you can ride a bike, and you see alligators and stuff. But it's actually part of Shark River Slough, which runs down the park, and that lets out into the Gulf, and so you can see sharks there.
Okay.
Yeah. That is always It's so you would not necessarily see a shark. You would not see a shark at Shark Valley, but it's part of Shark River Slough.
That's one of the things that terrifies me about the ocean in general. There are so many big, toothy critters in the ocean that it makes it really kind of scary to get in there. Alligators, crocodiles, sharks. It's just they rule the water, and it makes it really hard for me to enjoy my time out there.
I think it's all about your comfort levels. I definitely, down here with alligators and stuff, you don't want to take a small dog or a small child into the water. We wouldn't recommend that. But I remember I was hiking once in a Western park, and where was I? Was I Colorado National Monument? I can't remember where I was. And we were just on this amazing trail, totally isolated. And there were all of a sudden bighorn sheep appeared out of nowhere. And that didn't make me feel very good either. So I don't I feel like it's just kind of your comfort level. And and for me, I was just like, whoa, a sheep. But now I don't really think, I am cautious about what I do in the water, but you kind of know when you're safe and when you're not. So I'm not totally freaked out. I think it's like anything. You get to know an area, that animals are not necessarily out there. They're not, it's only if you disturb them, right?
Sure.
So even a land animal. So for the most part, you feel safe. You know where you can go. I guess is a good point to bring up. There's another way that people. So what I talked about with the chickies, that's very advanced. Anyone could do it. You got to plan for it. You got to do you have to work. You don't want to just like do that your first time by yourself.
Right.
And the park rangers will help you plan that trip, and you could do it. But there are ways you can kind of explore the Everglades and the water without taking that big of a trip in. One is like shorter canoe rides and shorter kayak trips. But another way is we do something here called a sluice-log. You ever heard of that? Another great term. Yeah. So a sluice-log, again, it's like the sloughs are the areas where they're a little bit deeper, and so water tends to flow. And so one of the things that park rangers will do here is if you sign up, you can go out on a sluice-log where it's essentially you're just walking through the Everglades in water. And I have done that.
That sounds even scarier.
The first time I did it, I will admit I was just like, alligators are everywhere. Like, what is this? I'm not, and I sometimes do feel very urban in those moments. I'm just like, this is not like, where am I? I don't know. It's just like, what is at my feet or whatever. But now it doesn't even faze me because you learn about where alligators are and how they act, right? And so in these areas where the water is actually the park rangers usually know the alligators that live in the area, and they know where they are, and it's they know if they're not nuisance alligators. Not gonna, like I said, there's no reason for an alligator to attack a person unless they're being threatened or they're fed and they've learned to depend on humans, which we don't allow in the park. So it's safe. And when you go out on these sluice logs, I've done it in the context of you hike out to these areas called cypress domes, which are just full of cypress trees. And it's almost like when you walk in, I think someone once described it to me as being kind of like a cathedral. Like it feels very spiritual when you get out there, and it's magical. And so that's where you're headed when you go there. And you just, the alligators, they don't usually go in those areas. They're not going to come and go to these like narrow areas where people are walking. You always want to be aware. You're never going to tell someone like, oh, don't, just go out there without thinking, but you actually walk with a stick. And the stick is to make sure you don't fall. But I know the alligator biologist here uses a stick to hit the alligators if they are aggressive, which they shouldn't. You don't hit alligators, but if one attacked you, it doesn't personally make me feel better to have that stick with me.
No, it wouldn't make me feel much better either. I've always heard that alligators aren't the ones you have to watch out for. It's the crocodiles that tend to be more aggressive.
Yeah, I think crocodiles tend to have more aggressive behavior, but the alligators are freshwater. So when we do sluice-logs and stuff, that's what you're gonna see. Yeah. A mama alligator is gonna defend her nest, so that is something to think about with that. But they don't, like, again, we know where the nests are in the park. So, but yes, in general, crocodiles tend to be a little bit more aggressive. And those are in the saltwater areas,
right?
Not where we're just like walking around
with sticks.
Yeah, with sticks.
You mentioned earlier that your work more centers around taking scientific data, compressing it, and distributing it to different organizations or groups of people. Am I right?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So what are some of the things that have been happening in Everglades National Park that you've been analyzing and distributing information? For example, I just read an article or a little snippet of an article that talked about the Everglades being one of the most threatened parks in the United States. I didn't finish the article, but I assumed it has something to do with global warming, rising water levels, and encroaching on habitat.
So when I think of like the major issues surrounding the Everglades National Park, the things that pop into my head are Everglades restoration, which is, when we say that here, we're mostly referring to getting the water right, which I can go into more detail about if you'd like. The other thing I think about are invasive species and the issues surrounding that. And then the other one is what you brought up is climate change and sea level rise.
Well, let's start with the very first one then, getting the water right. What's that even mean? So
yeah, I know. And when I first started too, I was like, isn't everything Everglades restoration? Like, aren't we, like, isn't it all restoration management? But what that means down here is water. We often say water is the lifeblood of the park. It's what allows it to all the animals and the plants to survive. Like everything, you know, water is important, but down here, water is a big deal. You would think like, oh, we're something that surprised me when I started was I was like, of course, water is a big deal, but we're not a desert. Like, what you know, we obviously get a lot of rain, you know, in the summers and stuff, but there's just not always enough water to go around, even though we get a lot of water. So in the park itself is in South Florida and in the Everglades ecosystem. So the park is very protected, but there's other parts of the Everglades ecosystem that are developed. And we are dependent on the water that comes from those developed areas in the park. There's a large lake called Lake Okeechobee that's kind of in the center of Florida. I always say it's like where Disney is, not far from there. And that is, we call it, you know, there's water that leads into Lake Okeechobee, but Lake Okeechobee is really like the heart of the water. If you want to make all these analogies to, you know, a body, it's like the heart that it's where all the waters, a lot of the water is being held. And then that water originally back, you know, before white settlers, really, because everyone's always managed the water to survive in the Everglades, but it wasn't really until white settlers came that they really changed the way the water flows in the Everglades. It would flow naturally as like a sheet. They call it sheet flow. Remember, because there's those slight changes in elevation.
Right.
So from Lake Okeechobee up here, the water would just kind of trickle down into the park, which is right here, and then that would trickle down into Florida Bay. And that happened naturally and with the seasons. So we would get the right quantity of water in the Everglades at the right time. So whether it was in the dry season, you still need some water, just not as much, but in the wet season, you get a lot of water. We always say quantity time. It was high quality water, so it wasn't, you know, didn't have phosphorus, it wasn't high in phosphorus. And it was distributed across the park or across the Everglades. And what happened was I think it was 1947, you know, back in the day when humans thought that we could white settlers thought we could fix everything by messing everything up. But the point was, so what happened was that Florida was being developed and they wanted areas like to Miami, and Fort Lauderdale to thrive, you know, and to be able to build. So it created a problem because you don't want this natural sheet flow of water across developed areas, right? You have to protect people from flooding. That's always the balance. And so what they did is this thing called the Central and South Florida Flood Protection Plan. And it kind of compartmentalized the water so it didn't naturally flow down. And I believe that was in 1947. And that always stands out to me because that was also the same year the park was founded. So it was like this weird, you know, always this acknowledgement that we need development down here. And this is a great place for agriculture. This is a great place to, you know, for sugar. It's a great place for, for oranges, all of that. But at the same time, the Everglades is very special and we need to protect it. And there's also this acknowledgement that actually our aquifer, so what we depend on for drinking water, what people depend on is dependent on the Everglades being functional because it actually filters the water for us. So it's always been that play. And so what happened was, though, that they did a really great job at flood protection, which was one of the major goals. And the area was able to thrive and you know, it grow as an urban area. But it was really bad for the ecosystem. And it basically cut off Everglades National Park, what was then Everglades National Park, from Lake Okeechobee. So from its source of water.
Oh boy.
And yeah. And so it got really bad. The wildlife, the alligators were nesting less and in places that they normally didn't nest. And then also Florida Bay. A lot of people rely on Florida Bay for their livelihood, for fishing. And there wasn't enough fresh water going into Florida Bay because Florida Bay it's an estuary. There wasn't enough fresh water coming into that, so it was very salty, and that would cause the seagrass, which is the foundation of Florida Bay, to start to die off. The fish depend on the seagrass, and then there's a huge die off, and it actually blocks the sunlight, and then there are algae blooms. So people it wasn't.
Jeez.
I wasn't here, but I read about it and it seemed like it was just so tangible about what was happening that there was this connection to like, oh, whoa, that was a mistake. Like we did too much managing of the water. The water wasn't coming during the dry season when people needed water right down here for farming and for drinking, but people also but the park needs the water then too. So there was this acknowledgement that even when we do get the water, it wasn't necessarily at the right time. We needed it to be more in line with how we would usually get it seasonally. So anyway, everyone recognized it, and I took a lot of credit. It was pretty, everyone was like, we need to fix this. This is a big problem. This is not good for people. It's not good for wildlife. It's not good for the park. It's just a problem. So in about 2000, I mean, there were some foundation projects before then that helped to fix the water problem, but it really was in 2000 where they passed this huge bill called the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan, where it was all about getting the quantity, quality, timing, and distribution of water in South Florida right. And so it wasn't just the park, it was across the Southern Florida landscape. And partly is that because people were being affected north of the park, but it's also a recognition that the park depends on water that is not park land, so outside of federal government properties. So that's been a big initiative down here for a long time now.
It's amazing that it's that delicate. I didn't realize that one water source affected that whole area.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. It really did, and it normally it would not be that. It was because all of the water from Lake Okeechobee was managed, and if you look at a map now, it's like it's just all canals and compartmentalized. So that one source of water really, that's a really good point. I never thought of it like that, but that's true.
And of course, as the area began to develop, you mentioned invasive species control.
Yes.
I'm sure people started bringing in exotic pets, and we'll take the one I always think of as pythons.
Yeah.
Is that a problem down the Everglades?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, we do. The Burmese python is kind of like I'd like to think of it, and I'd like others to start thinking of it too, as like the spokesperson for the spokespecies for the invasive species problem, but it's one of many. Burmese pythons get a lot of attention because one, they have had a very negative impact on the Everglades ecosystem. They are throughout the Everglades right now. We don't talk about eradicating them. We talk about managing them. It's to the point that we don't think we're ever gonna. We never say never, but we haven't yet developed a method that can eradicate them. But we try to manage them.
They seem almost like a wild hog to me, just because how quickly they spread, and once they're in there, you can't get them out.
Yeah, they're so hard to find. You hear stories all the time about people like radio tracking them, and you'll be like standing right next to one. Yeah, talk about that's so I guess it's creepy. It's like you might be standing right next to a Burmese python, and you don't even know until you like turn on the transmitter and like, oh, there it is.
Oh crap!
Yeah. But that's also an indication of how much they too are not like. We always remind people are very afraid of the alligators, but actually probably more afraid of the Burmese pythons. And it's just a reminder that they too don't really bother people. Like they're not going to come out and bother you. So it's not so much a threat to visitors. We always remind them it's just decimated the ecosystem. So the most tangible. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, what are the things that the Burmese python have affected the most? What species?
The small mammals. So one of the most conclusive studies, again, you can't say cause, but they are surely correlated, was that there were these really adorable marsh rabbits down here in the Everglades. I have never seen, been here 3.5 years. But when you talk to people, 10 years ago, they saw these marsh rabbits throughout the ecosystem, everywhere. In Shark Valley, they saw them. And you don't see them anymore. And you can correlate the increase in the population of Burmese python with the decrease in the population in marsh rabbits. So the point, I've never seen one. I should have seen one by now, and I've never seen one. So that is one really direct impact you've seen that we've seen on the ecosystem.
And in the Everglades, you mentioned it's more about management of the python now, just this one particular invasive species. Is it kind of accepted that they're just going to be a part of the landscape now? That they're there?
I don't like to say accepted. That depends. That's probably going to depend on who you talk to. You know, if you talk to our invasive species biologists, they're probably going to say yes. I guess I wouldn't just say it like that because it's not. I don't want it to sound like we've given up.
Right.
There's so much resources going towards the Burmese python and other invasives that are established that I want to talk about.
Yeah. I want to talk about. We don't want to give all the glory to the python.
Yeah, no, because that's a problem because people don't realize they think it's all the Burmese python and they don't realize there's still stuff we can do to help with other invasives. So in that respect, I don't think it's all doom and gloom because we are trying so much. They're always doing different research methods on ways that, for example, I don't want to get into the nitty gritty of it because I think I would butcher it, but they are doing pheromone studies where they're trying to use basically implanted pythons to attract other pythons to them so that they can at least like get huge congregations of pythons removed at once rather than one at a time. So there's also working on, so there's a lot of methods, they call it tools in the toolbox, and people are constantly trying to develop them and figure out better ways to help with the Burmese python. But that being said, the idea that we're going to completely remove them from the Everglades is pretty, like, no one says that. At this point, it doesn't look hopeful that that's going to happen. But we haven't given up completely on it. It's not like we're just like, that's a problem we're not dealing with.
What are some of the other invasive species? What's on your radar?
The plants.
Oh, really?
Yeah. There's really these 4 big invasive species plants that are invasive. It's actually one employee is mostly, it's 1 or 2 employees are mostly in charge of managing. One of them is Melaleuca, there's Lygodium, this old world climbing fern, Brazilian pepper. I always forget the last one. And it drives me crazy. It's always 4, it's like I'll forget the last visitor center. Brazilian pepper, Melaleuca, Lygodium. That's going to drive me crazy.
You'll think of it later.
Yeah. Anyway, so those are the ones. I have to look it up.
So I guess in the broader ecosystem, what do these plants do? Do they grow so rapidly that they choke out the native species?
Exactly. That's exactly what they do. And so, here we go. Okay, so the big 4 are Melaleuca, Australian pine, old world climbing fern, and Brazilian pepper.
Perfect.
Okay, and so in general, yes, they choke out native species in different ways, right? And that can dramatically change the landscape of the Everglades. I'll give you one example that's a pretty interesting one, and it's actually an example of us. We're gonna be able to remove it. There's a place in the park that was originally farmland, interestingly enough, inside the park, right inside the national park. And what happened was that the farmland, when the park acquired it, was in such degraded conditions that this one invasive plant, Brazilian pepper, invaded. And that's the thing about a degraded ecosystem, right? So we talk about, to link it to Everglades restoration, if a habitat is healthy, if the Everglades are healthy, it's less likely that any kind of exotic is going to be able to take over. They just don't do as well. But in these highly degraded areas, like in this hole in the donut, we call it the hole in the donut, this farmland area. I know I've heard so many stories about why it's called that. And the one I hear the most is that when you looked at it from an airplane, it looked literally like a hole in the donut, like in a pristine national park. There was just this hole, and
it was that degraded.
Yeah, it was farmland, so it was totally degraded. They were in the middle of that, and it just got overtaken by Brazilian pepper, and the Brazilian pepper was able to outcompete all the native species. So it was just basically dense strands of Brazilian pepper in the middle of a national park. And so they actually have done this whole restoration program. It's called the Hole in the Donut Project. And they were able to scrape to the bedrock all the way down, and all the way down to the limestone bedrock. They have to get all the way down so that all the seeds are removed and everything. And they do this with, how do you do that? Just big machines, big construction machinery, removing it. It's really cool to see it. They call it the scrape. And what they've been able to do in this one area is they're almost done, but they've been able to return it to basically the way it should have been with the native plants. So just by leaving the area scraped down to the bedrock, all the native plants come back and they colonize it.
That sounds like a tremendous amount of work to remove one plant.
Yeah, it is. That I like that story, and that's a good point because this is one area of the park that we've been successful in removing this exotic plant, or almost are. The project is coming to a completion, but how do you pay for that, right? Like that's one area, and there's exotic plants throughout the park, and the way that this project is paid for is actually through wetland mitigation credits.
Mm-hmm.
So it can be paid for in that way, and I won't get into the all the details of that, but for a lot of reasons that's not possible for many projects in the park. But that's how that one was able to be funded and done. So they have staff that is fully devoted to it, able to pay these contracts to remove that. But in most exotic, with the invasive species, there's just so many of them here. So there's the plants, and I wanted to highlight them, and all the efforts that we're doing for those plants. I mean, but a lot of it is just our botanist goes out in a helicopter sometimes and just like aerial sprays areas to remove them, exotic plants. Another way is with fire. So in a way, so the prescribed fires sometimes will help remove the exotic plants, and that's another way of doing it. Sometimes there's also what we call like quick responses. So if somebody reports a new invasive plant in an area, our botanist will go out and just like
take it out.
Yeah, take it out, usually cut and treat. But the thing to always remember with this is too, it's like weeding a garden, right? So even when you go and do it, you have to go back and check and make sure it's been removed, or maybe treat it again because it didn't work.
Mm-hmm.
So it's constantly, it's like, it's like the Burmese python problem in that it's just a constant, like you're just having to go out. And the thing about the Burmese pythons, you have this tangible relationship, right? For being able to be like, oh, they removed the Burmese python population increased and the number of marsh rabbits decreased, right? We don't see them anymore. And with a lot of the invasive plant species, they were actually planted. We planted them in the Everglades to help dry the water up so development could happen. So their entire goal of these invasive plants, some of them, are to, I think it's Melaleuca. The purpose is it was to dry up the Everglades. So that's the tangible. So the effect on the ecosystem is just as bad as the effect of the Burmese python on the ecosystem.
We are such an intelligent breed.
Well, at least we try to fix our mistakes, right? But yeah, that is it's very interesting because like one of the ways that we're trying to control exotic plants is using biocontrols.
Mm-hmm.
So like releasing insects that will prey only specifically on a specific invasive plant, right? And I remember when I first heard that, I was just like, because now I work in this communication realm. I was like, how am I going to tell people this is, we did so many mistakes in the past. How do we know that this one's okay? But actually going to the lab and seeing what they do, I think the difference now is that there is so much concern that we're going to have another mistake that they put so many checkpoints in to all of these treatments, whether it's a biocontrol, herbicide, all of it. It has to go through so many rounds of tests to make sure that this is something that is only going to affect one species, isn't going to go out and decimate the ecosystem. So I think what we've learned is that we need to be super careful and test.
I guess that's what makes the global warming thing so scary, is because I mean it affects everything. I mean, how do you stop rising water from encroaching into the Everglades?
So there's actually, what we like to say is that you can fight some of the salt water with fresh water. So that's one way. So Everglades restoration, where we're trying to get more of that fresh water down into the park, is actually one way to fight sea level rise, because the fresh water will actually push the salt water down. So it's
just
like
because of the densities, or
changes in densities, and it will actually push the salt water down and keep it lower. So that is
That's fascinating.
It is cool. And I like those examples because it's like, oh, there is something we can do. We just need to, for now, I mean, I might get to a point where the sea level rise the rate is so high. But at this point, we know that if we get more fresh water into Florida Bay, it's going to create the right estuarine conditions that the animals are going to thrive.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've read a couple of books. There's a little town in the Chesapeake Bay that is slowly but surely just being taken over because of the rising sea levels, and it's those people were so.
Hold on one second.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's okay.
If anyone's watching and they have any questions, feel free to type them in the chat. We're going to be wrapping up with Antonia here pretty soon. So if you have any questions, I can ask them at the end. And if you're just popping in, we've got a little bit of a kid break. So once she comes back, we're going to move on to some of the things that Everglades National Park is doing for outreach, ways you can experience the park without being there, stuff like that. You're fine. You're fine.
Okay. I don't know. She doesn't normally wake up crying like that. Okay. What were you talking?
Yeah. We were just talking about the rising sea levels, but her coming in gives me a pretty good segue.
Okay.
What kind of outreach does Everglades do with, say, educational programs for high schools, elementary schools? How do they get kids involved to learn about everything that's going on in the park?
Okay, so so specifically students or just like
in general, the public.
So there are ranger-led tours at each one of our visitor center areas, so you can always do that, and that's one way to reach out. The education program here reaches out to schools. It used to be kind of in the local area, but you know what? COVID kind of made things interesting, and I am so impressed with what they've done. And now they do all these virtual programs right now, and they have reached students as far as I think I've heard Germany. And so they have really been able to extend out their radius and reach programs that way. So that is another way. Those are mostly, they do some high school. They do a high school program about the Nike missile base, which is this interesting historic part of the park that has been preserved. But they also do a lot of middle school programming as well. I've been doing some citizen science, so I focus primarily on high school students. And I'm just getting that started. But that's been programs like doing water quality testing with students. Just started trying to go out and barcode. So you figure out the fungi biodiversity in the park. So you do I don't know how to, so it's called DNA barcoding.
Okay.
We're going out with students, we're collecting fungi in the park, and then we try to take it back to a lab and extract the DNA out and figure out what species they are. And that's what been high school students as well.
Awesome. Do they come away from those experiences like really pumped up and excited?
I hope so. It's all very new. So I've just done a few programs myself with the citizen science stuff, and I think it does. I think, but what I have to say also in the education programs, when they take students out on sluice logs and get them out in the park, it gets me pretty pumped up even now. So I think they leave just like, I think you get students when you go out in the water. I think the sluice logs are pretty cool for students to do. You imagine like you're just like, all of a sudden you're going to go out, walk onto the water, and you could you're safe, and you go, a lot of times I've seen students start being like, I don't know about this, I don't want to do it. And then at least from my experience, then they don't want to get out of the water, It's
Oh
like,
no, that's the
yeah,
most engaging type of experience a kid can undergo. I
yeah,
mean, you have a physical connection with the park at that point.
right, yeah. And I think
Uh,
it's really cool to see. It's kind of the story that's told in a lot of places, but here you get students from who grew up in Miami and they've never been to Everglades National Park. So even just to get them to know that this is their backyard, like this is their park.
and that's one of the whole reasons why I wanted to talk to you. I'm making it a goal to try to talk to different national parks because I feel like there are a lot of people, maybe less so in the days of COVID, but they don't realize what's in their back door.
Yeah.
For me, it's tangible. I can look out my back door and see the Rocky Mountains. So I know they're there and I just have to go up and explore them. But something like the Everglades, if
Yeah.
you're not down in that area, to me, I never think about it.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I never thought about the West, where you see the mountains. So you know that the mountains are calling, right? Isn't that a thing? Is that what they say? You're right. In the Everglades, you don't necessarily know that it's there because it's not, you have to like drive to it to see it because everything's flat. I think there's some fear surrounding it as well, just like you were talking about, people are afraid of the alligators. But I think the other thing is it's kind of a cultural thing. Like I didn't grow up going to national parks or being taken to a national park. And I think that if you aren't really shown them, you don't really, even if you know they're there, you don't really feel comfortable or know what it means to go to them. And so that's what I think outreach and education are so important because you might be giving a student that first experience and holding their hand to take them there. And then they're likely to do that for their kids. The national parks, this is kind of a tangent, but I do feel that national parks sometimes can seem inaccessible. There's been one demographic that's been able to, that knows about them and goes to them. And part of our job is to make sure that everyone feels like these parks are theirs because they are.
Yeah, I take it for granted sometimes that I grew up in a family where I was exposed to the outdoors a lot. From the
Yeah.
time I was 5 years old, we were out hunting, fishing, camping. So I knew about all these things, and I really crave being outdoors and exploring. And I forget sometimes that not everybody has that same experience.
Yeah, you kind of have to be shown. I always liken to me. I know how to navigate a subway. I grew up doing that. Like from the time I was born, from my earliest memories, as I could get on a train in New York City and get where I needed to go, or I could walk through a neighborhood and feel safe because I knew where to walk and what was good and how to act. And I think the same thing is like if you translate that to a national park, it can be very intimidating. And to me, I still sometimes I've been doing this for a long time, and I still sometimes am intimidated when I go to a national park by myself. I'm like worried about getting lost, worried about having cell service. So I'm losing the ability to relate, but I still kind of have it. And I know how intimidating they can be. And yeah, so it's just getting people to know, that there are free days. There are days where you can actually go to the national park for free. So you don't have to charge the entrance. And if you just, look that up, National Park Service fee-free days. There's different ones every year. There's one coming up for National Park Week. I think it's April 17th. Can't remember exactly, but it's around then. And you can go to the park for free, and this is how you get there, and this is what you can do when you're there.
That's interesting. Is all that information on the Everglades website?
Yes, yeah. That's a National Park Service wide initiative, the fee-free days.
Okay.
But they're also posted on all the different park websites.
Okay. Just so you know, that feeling of being scared outdoors, I still have that.
Yeah.
Every time I go out in the mountains, I think a mountain lion's going to get me. So
Yeah.
that never leaves.
But maybe it's a healthy fear.
I
It's a
guarantee.
situational awareness fear.
Exactly. Antonia, what are some of the ways that just average people can help out with some of the stuff that Everglades National Park is doing?
I think just kind of what we talked about. I always tell people tell a friend. So if you learned something today, if you learned about Everglades restoration, if you learned about invasive species and the problem here, let someone know. That's a very easy way to just kind of get the word out. And I think like everything is just, we're about to like do a whole thing about water, right? And how you can conserve water. That's good for everyone, everywhere. Taking shorter showers, doing that stuff. My thing is the balloons. We find, everyone has like their pet peeves. That's mine. You often go to Everglades National Park, and especially when you're out in the middle of nowhere, like if I get to tag along with someone when they're doing their research, very often you see just a random balloon there. And I don't think people realize that when they're out there. I don't think they realize that the balloon that you release, I don't even know where. I'm assuming in Florida, but maybe not. I don't know. That balloon is going to have a history, and it's going to fall somewhere. And it often is in these like areas where you can't easily get to them. So being aware of that, reducing your plastic.
I found a balloon on the side of an 8,000-foot mountain.
Yeah, I know. Balloons are a problem.
Yeah.
We
need to start a hashtag, stop the balloons.
I think there is a hashtag. I don't remember what it is, but there definitely is.
I'm going to find it.
So that usual stuff, just leave no trace. We have a big initiative in the Park Service in general to do that. In Everglades National Park, we also really encourage people to drive the speed limits. We have a main park road that takes you all the way from the Ernst Co Visitor Center down to Flamingo. And people often drive above the speed limit. And I don't know, it's one of those things where you're on this like long straight road and you probably don't realize it's like, well, I'm not going to kill anyone. No one's around, but you could kill a wildlife. And so that's another way. It's just like abiding by speed limits in parks, I think, is key. They're in there to protect the wildlife and the visitors, but
right. Yeah, following rules is very important. They're there, like you said, they're there for a reason. And something I've been trying to stress is making sure that if you're a visitor, talk to people such as yourselves, DNR officials, national park officials. They're all passionate outdoors people. They care about the environment. Spend time talking to those people and learning a little bit.
Yeah. And then tell a friend.
That's it.
Spread the knowledge.
Antonia, sorry, we've went for about an hour now. I think I've quenched my curiosity.
Yeah. Okay.
Is there anything else you'd like to add or say?
No, just thank you for highlighting the park. And I just really want to encourage people to not be intimidated by the Everglades, especially if you're out in the West. And I think it's a very unique habitat that is worth seeing and experiencing. I hope you make it out there.
Well, if I do, I'm going to go chickie hopping. So
yes.
That's my goal. Thank you very much for spending time talking to me. I really appreciate it.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
All right. Bye.